Hey folks, buckle up for the latest in the war on American public history and the foundations of America's civic culture. All dressed up in the familiar language of excellence, parental rights, and civic virtue. But let's not get off track here. It's an attempt to control how history is taught, how the founding, how basic American principles are twisted, and about who gets to define the truth. The recent push to reshape American education that is actually going to be turbocharged this week with the dismantling of the Department of Education is not about honest engagement with the past or its relationship with the present. It's about ensuring that a version of history serves a political purpose, reinforcing a selective, sanitized, and deeply ideological version of the American story. This fictive, narrow presentation of something that looks and walks and talks a lot like American history, but ain't it. We're talking about the Phoenix Declaration and the dismantling of American education. Enter the Heritage Foundation. Those folks who brought you Project 2025, and we see how that's going. They just released the Phoenix Declaration, an American vision for education, the latest in a long line of attacks on American public education. This document is not about improving education. It's about remaking it into a machine for ideological control. So the Phoenix thing claims to promote educational excellence, but instead it lays out a vision for school that seems on the surface reasonable, right? It calls for transparency, academic rigor, and cultural transmission. Who could possibly disagree with that? Although, like all of their stuff, all you have to do is scratch the surface just a little bit, engage in just the basic level of critical thinking, and the whole framework, like their whole idea of what America is, falls apart. What it actually advocates is a system where history is rewritten to suit nationalist narratives, public education is undermined in favor of private, often religious schooling, and we're not talking about just any religious schooling here. Objective truth is defined by political ideology rather than historical fidelity, hardly objective, and difficult histories, especially those dealing with race, gender, and inequality, the kind of issues that in fact shaped what America has become because of resistance to oppression, are erased or reframed. In other words, it's a repackaging of the same old effort to propagandize American history into a nationalist fever dream, dismissing the realities of systemic oppression and enshrining this mythologized version of the nation's past. And then they engage in this weaponization of the founders, like they love to do, right? As always, cue the Thomas Jefferson quote. This time it's his 1816 warning that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. It's a fair point, except that they're using it to justify an educational model that actively discourages critical thought. And then there's John Adams, and everybody loves to pull him out. I'm surprised they didn't reach for Thomas Paine. In any case, Adams' words on virtue are twisted into an argument for moral gatekeeping in education. The problem isn't, though, that history is too complicated for students to understand. It's that those pushing this framework don't want students to understand. If they understood honest American history, then they'd start asking questions about what the F are you doing? What these folks want, and what this represents, is reverence. They want genuflection, not critical thinking. They want obedience, not engagement. The Phoenix Declaration uses these cherry-picked quotes from the founders to create this false sense of historical consensus, connecting the past to the present, suggesting that this is the ideological heirs to them, but portraying the founders as champions of a rigid moral and civic order that conveniently aligns with the political goals of its authors. And that's not about historical fidelity. It's about weaponizing the past to justify ideological control of the present. And then there's the parental rights Trojan horse. One of the most dangerous aspects of this framework is its emphasis on parental rights in education. What it really means is this: history should be taught only in ways that align with a particular political and cultural worldview. If it actually suits their plans, it's good, it works, it's fine. If it doesn't, it's erased, it's gone, it's out. When they say parents should have control over what their children learn, They mean removing books that challenge their propagandized version of history. They mean suppressing discussions about race, gender, inequality. They mean making sure that LGBTQ plus students and histories remain invisible. They also advocate for public education funding to follow the child, which is a polite way of saying defund public education in favor of private and religious schools. These are not policies designed to strengthen education. They are designed to dismantle it, like they are dismantling everything else. And then there's the myth of objective truth. This framework repeatedly invokes objective truth as if history is a simple matter of stating the facts. Oh, that's fun. That leads to understanding. But history is actually all about context. It's all about interpretation. It's all about understanding how power operates and how power shapes that context and that interpretation. They use this phrase, science must be grounded in reality, not ideological fads, is laughable coming from them. It's a clear nod to attacks on climate science and LGBTQ identities. In practice, their version of objective truth means excluding perspectives that challenge their power structure. And they insist that students must learn about good and evil. But when did history become a fairy tale? When did it become a therapy session? It's messy, contradictory, deeply human, and requires all voices to make sense of it. The push for moral education, based upon their rigid view of morality, is often a way of teaching a narrow worldview where America is always the hero. And more to the point, dissent is dangerous. You depart from that, you are not just un-American, you are anti-American. Which gets us to the patriotism trap. A central goal of this education model is to instill a version of patriotism, a kind of patriotism. But this has got nothing to do with love for your country. It's not the kind that comes from actually understanding your history, how we got from there to now, and everybody who fought to expand our rights and therefore our responsibilities as citizens. No. Instead, it's a compulsory, unquestioning kind of patriotism. A kind of authoritarian nationalism that commands obedience. This document calls for reviving shared civic rituals like the Pledge of Allegiance. Read, enforce nationalist conformity in schools. I would suspect that probably going to a NASCAR race is also going to be something compelled. Teaching students to see America as a force for good, even in its failings. Read, propagandize history to protect national pride and the fragile feelings of white people. Make sure students appreciate our Western and Judeo-Christian traditions. Read, centering white, Christian, Eurocentric narratives as the default and excluding everyone else. Patriotism in education should mean teaching students to engage with our country's history honestly, to learn from its successes and to learn even more from its failures, to ask difficult questions and then to participate in shaping its future in an informed way. But the kind of patriotism promoted in the Phoenix Declaration isn't about engagement. It's about compliance. It's about teaching children to accept a version of America that demands loyalty rather than understanding, that demands an embrace of fiction rather than an understanding of reality. If you have to mandate patriotism, then you're not teaching history. You're indoctrinating. So what can we do? This fight isn't theoretical. It's happening in real time. The Phoenix Declaration lays the groundwork for dismantling American education under the guise of reform, and we're going to be hearing a lot about it over the next week. The erosion of public education, the attacks on historical integrity, and the narrowing of acceptable narratives are all part of this broader dogmatic assault. And so what do we in fact practically do? I'm not telling you to call your member of Congress. That's not working out quite so well. You can expose the agenda. Educators, public historians, and advocates must continue to call out how those policies undermine education rather than improve it. Post and share your views on it. 2. Defend public education. Support public schools and policies that ensure access to a rigorous, inclusive, and fact-based education. Find out when your school board is meeting and get there. 3. Challenge revisionist narratives. When you see history being distorted, call it out. You are all public historians too. Engage with educational content that prioritizes honest history, truth, over ideology and dogma. Find out who is actually an appeaser, who is a collaborator, and who is a resistor. Stick with them and boost it. Do that by supporting real history and the people telling it. Engage with and amplify the voices of public historians, educators, and those institutions, and they are increasingly few, committed to projecting and protecting honest history. They think that we can forget all of this stuff if they erase it, if they push it to the side. That's not how history works, and we're not going to let them.